The only feasible conclusion is that the organization was deliberately captured, and President Zuma and Mr. Moyane played critical roles in the capture of SARS and dismantling it. We have a head of government who joins the process to reduce the very revenues he needs to enable the government to discharge its responsibilities, up to the point of the possible collapse of that government. The only logical way to explain it is that, challenging as it might be, even to comprehend, here we're dealing with a wolf in sheepskin.
Now, I've always been confused about two things. When Rob Hersov speaks about the fact that Jacob Zuma is broke and that he allowed everyone else steal, but he didn't steal, that's mind-boggling. And secondly, when Thabo Mbeki sort of seems to support the ANC government, but at the same time criticize the ANC government, it has always confused me. But this video puts many things into context, and I would expect you guys to watch till the end. You're actually encouraged to watch to the end if you really love South Africa and you really want to understand why the ANC government seems to be struggling to liberate a country that seems to be in bondage. Thabo Mbeki puts a lot of things into context, from the history of the South African Communist Party all the way to the present. And I think I'll be breaking those down to help us really understand and have a condensed understanding of why South Africa is struggling, especially in governance, and also setting itself free from the clutches of neocolonialism and possibly communism. Now let's listen to what Thabo Mbeki has to say about the ANC and communism, and I'll be back for some analysis.
During the years 2008-2009, the world economy suffered a recession as a result of the banking crisis, which started in the United States in 2008 with the collapse of the major bank Lehman Brothers, which filed for bankruptcy on the 15th of September 2008. And that global crisis resulted in our country losing 1 million jobs, and the damage could have been worse. And fortunately, during this period, we're investing in infrastructure in good measure to prepare for the 2010 Soccer World Cup. In addition, were the budget surpluses which enabled government to engage in counter-cyclical measures. Other things being equal, like other emerging economies, our country could have recovered from the economic recession fairly quickly. However, other things were not equal, centrally because of the endogenous political changes to which I have referred. As recently as 2 years ago, in April 2022, the online journal Politics Web published an article by the eminent African academic and intellectual Herman Gilliomé, entitled "When the ANC Lost Its Brain." And this provides a clue to the political change I have mentioned. All of us are familiar with the concept of the Rooi Gevaar, which was strongly advanced by the apartheid regime and establishment. In his treatise, Afrikaner Anti-Communist History Production in South African Historiography, Wessel Visser has written that in the 1950s, Piet Meyer published a pamphlet containing a concise history of communist activity in South Africa. The cover page displayed an ominous specter of a Bolshevist looming like a giant over a Christian city in South Africa. Wielding a hammer and a sickle, the giant went about destroying the city. And Meyer illustrated how this South African Communist Party's policy was repeatedly defined and dictated by Moscow. And in his book, The Red Trap, Communism and Violence in South Africa, Chris Vermaak, a South African security police officer, asserted that a Soviet-inspired communist plot was being hatched to foster anti-apartheid sabotage, subversion, and revolution in South Africa. And he said agents of the SACP infiltrated organizations like the National Union of South African Students, the ANC, Mkhonto weSizwe, South African Congress of Trade Unions, and even the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. And according to this historiography, the objectives of the Freedom Charter, quote, carried the unmistakable stamp of communism as the SAP acted in international cohesion with Russia.
Yes, so if I understand correctly, Thabo Mbeki speaks about how the apartheid regime referred to the threat, the global threat of communism as, I think it's a Roy Kafir, attached redness, the redness of communism. Trying to refer to the threat of communism, the apartheid regime referred to the communist Soviet Union at the time as the Red Kafirs, okay? Now, when you listen to Thabo Mbeki, he also speaks about how the apartheid regime sort of like sought to establish itself along the economic lines of capitalism, which he refers to here as the white man's way of life, which communism in itself was a threat to. And so there was this psychosis of fear at this period when most of the white South Africans who lived in the during the apartheid regime, and mostly especially who were beneficiaries of the apartheid regime, because you have to understand there were also whites who also were anti-apartheid consciousness. So they were actually against apartheid, right? But there were those who benefited from the apartheid regime, and they were conditioned to kind of like assume the consciousness of a capitalist white, African, so to speak, living within African space, okay? And so the threat of communism became sort of like a psychosis in the 1970s thereabout, to the fact that there was a threat to their way of life, and they had to really work hard to get this threat out of the way. Let's keep listening to what Thabo Mbeki speaks about how the ANC, in a way, as a proxy of Moscow, was being prepared to be the local version of this Roy Kafir, this red threat to the white man's way of life in South Africa. And that really opens up a lot of things, a Pandora box on how we would understand the origins of what the ANC represented at its inception, especially in governance from 1994 onwards. Listen.
And this document went on to say from the 1970s onwards, South Africa was now being perceived by the West from its strategic global position vis-a-vis Soviet and Chinese strategic intentions. And the discourse of the anti-communist publications of this period shifted accordingly from the Red Peril inside South Africa to the Soviet and Red Chinese menace and expansionism in African states bordering white South Africa. And elsewhere, Taryn Halsall and Johan Wasserman wrote that in the apartheid-era textbooks, in line with the political ideology of the National Party and within the context of the Cold War, Russia and communism was a red peril. Communism was foregrounded as a threat to especially capitalism and the white way of life. And Wessel Visser said that the average white South African, especially during the period 1974 to 84, was imbued with the psychosis of a fear of a worldwide communist threat. In January 2010, the Financial Times published an article by Alec Russell entitled Lunch with the F.W. de Klerk. And the article said that, encouraged by the fall of the Berlin Wall, which took away the Roy Kafir, or fear of a communist takeover, de Klerk was emboldened to press ahead with changes which led to the end of apartheid rule, unquote. The hard reality, however, is that not everybody in the apartheid establishment took this position concerning the Roy Kafir. For instance, in his book, The Afrikaner's Biography of a People, Herman Gilliomé writes, and I quote, "To preserve its image as a national movement, the ANC, as distinct from the South African Communist Party, did not commit itself to a socialist state. Instead, nationalists and communists alike propounded the theory of a national democratic revolution. In the first stage of this revolution, the goal was to take charge of the political and economic system, and from this basis, create the conditions for the transfer to socialism, which was to be the second stage.
Now, so you see, this NDR, National Democratic Revolution, is of high interest for me because I remember during the dissertation research which I did during my PhD studies, I really took time to really study about the NDR and how it was used in Ghana. So at the inception of Jerry Rawlings' regime in 1981, there were factions of the PNDC government at the time in Ghana that thought that the country should assume a national democratic revolution. In fact, there was a document that kind of like was tagged in this regard, in that it recognized itself as it recognized the December 31st revolution in Ghana, which was the revolution, the People's Revolution in the 1980s in Ghana, as a national democratic revolution. And we must understand that the NDR, the National Democratic Revolution, according to one of the favorite authors I have, Ebo Hotchful, he speaks about the fact that the NDR, the National Democratic Revolution, was a creation of the leftist faction of the PNDC government. And the leftist faction here kind of like explains the ideological divide that was within the PNDC at the time. And so the PNDC government had a leftist faction and a rightist faction. These two factions understood what a national democratic revolution represents in a different way. Why one thought that the NDR, the revolution, should be more along the side of socialism and put the country on a firm socialist stand, the rightist side understood the National Democratic Revolution as something else. And that caused a clash within the government and paralyzed the government for a while until Jerry Rawlings himself had to purge the PNDC government off, the leftists at that time. Okay. And so that was how he squashed the contradictions within the government in Ghana. So now I'm really scared that this is likely the same thing going on in the ANC. So in the ANC presently, and we'll still hear more about what Thabo Mbeki has to say, because Thabo Mbeki seems to be exonerating President Ramaphosa while demonizing former President Jacob Zuma, in the sense that Ramaphosa represents the rightist faction of the proponents of the National Democratic Revolution by the ANC, while Jacob Zuma represented the leftist faction, which gives more interpretation when Rob Hersov says that Jacob Zuma is broke, that he allowed everyone else steal, but he didn't steal because he was sort of like used as a vehicle, so to speak, to allow the effervescence and the policies and the drivers, the consciousness of the leftist National Democratic Revolution take full effect through the vehicle of the ANC that aimed to turn South Africa from a capitalist society as it had been established during the apartheid era into now what was supposed to be the future of South Africa, which would be a future communist or socialist and maybe full-blown communist nation. So this is what I'm hearing Thabo Mbeki speak about, and it's really interesting that we have parallels of this kind of issue that had occurred somewhere else in Africa, especially in white Africa, and that was actually the basis for my PhD studies. Okay, so for me it's really interesting that the same thing seems to be playing out in South Africa, but it's veiled under the consciousness of our constant decry of the ANC, and that the ANC is broke, the ANC is useless, the ANC is a paralytic government. But within the perspective of the ideologies paralyzing the ANC, this is what I'm beginning to slowly understand from Thabo Mbeki's speech. Let's keep listening to how he explains how the ANC was now prepared, especially through the vehicle of Jacob Zuma, to unleash the second phase of the National Democratic Revolution that sought to convert South Africa into a socialist society and then probably to a full-blown communist society, which during his regime, he argues here, he blocked and stopped that move. He delayed this is what he says in this video, that he delayed the process of the democratic revolution into. So he delayed that, and probably that's why maybe he had some challenges during his presidency. But let's keep listening to what Thabo Mbeki has to say about this, and I'll be back to conclude with a final analysis.
The author then says that wanting to put all his efforts into the NDR's first phase, Mbeki, quote, postponed the introduction of socialism indefinitely, unquote. You will understand from this quotation that to this day, sections among the old apartheid establishment continue to hold this entirely false view that the NDR, the fundamental policy of the ANC, is in fact an old communist policy. The argument states that the communists prescribed this NDR for countries emerging out of colonial domination, this being the first step on the road to socialism. Later, those leading the NDR would then take the next step, the introduction of socialism. It was exactly on this basis that Professor Khilio Mie wrote the article headed "When the ANC Lost Its Brain." And specifically he wrote, quote, "The ideology of the SACP was very close to that of the Soviet Union. And the SACP dominated the ANC-SACP alliance during the years of struggle. And the ANC's intimate relationship with the SACP and its association with Moscow have acquired something of a smell. It is clear that the paralysis that has seemed to grip the ANC government is due largely to the decline of communism as an ideology and the cessation of the flow of expert advice from Moscow." And quote, President Cyril Ramaphosa's appeals to his voters sounds increasingly like calls to stragglers who have lost, who are lost and without guidance, unquote. These comments communicate the convictions of those unlike F.W. de Klerk, who never believed that the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the disappearance of the Soviet Union meant an end to the Roy Gefar in South Africa. To the contrary, South Africa still had the SACP-dominated ANC, intent to advance from the NDR to socialism, regardless of the fact that it was experiencing some paralysis because it had lost its real brain, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, excuse me, and was therefore without guidance because of the cessation of the flow of expert advice from Moscow. Earlier, I quoted some analysts as having written that during the apartheid years, communism was foregrounded as a threat to especially capitalism and the white way of life. And this is exactly how those who were and are convinced that the NDR is a communist strategy leading to socialism understood the threat posed by the electoral victory of the ANC in 1994, that it would establish a system which was, quote, a threat especially to capitalism and the white way of life, unquote. And this threat had to be defeated. And it was exactly to realize the strategic objective that a group emerged from among especially the erstwhile apartheid security forces centered on the former military intelligence division of the SADF, whose objective was to ensure the defeat of the ANC, whose NDR and other policies continued to perpetuate the Roy Gefar. And this group was a leader and practical expression of the counter-revolution whose activities we will now discuss. And one of the important decisions taken by the counter-revolution was that to achieve its objective of defeating the ANC was to ensure that it fails in its task properly to govern our country. The second important and directly related decision was that the ANC had to be so weakened that it would not be able successfully to frustrate the realization of the first counter-revolutionary task that we have just mentioned. So in December 2007, the ANC held its 52nd National Conference in Polokwane in Limpopo. One of the tasks of the National Conference, like all others, was to elect the National Executive Committee, the NEC, which was done. Having taken the decision to weaken the ANC, the counter-revolution started already in 2002 to work on the task to change its leadership. The 2007 National Conference presented the counter-revolution with the opportunity to implement its plans in this regard. It therefore participated both in the preparations and the conference itself to ensure the success of those it favored as members of the NEC National Executive Committee. In this regard, I must mention a very important matter concerning the reality about South Africa, which we're discussing. This is that the apartheid regime had paid a lot of attention to the task to infiltrate as many of its agents as possible into the ANC and the rest of the broad democratic movement. Though much was done by the ANC to discover and expose these enemy agents, the hard reality is that a considerable number of these remained undetected within our ranks. So quite early after the formation of the 1994 Government of National Unity, we approached the heads of the SADF, the Defense Force, South African Police, and the NIS, National Intelligence Service, to request that they give us a list of these agents so that we could discuss with and demobilize them. And effectively, all three services turned down our request. The counter-revolution used these agents in the ranks of the ANC to intervene in the Polokwane National Conference as it did. And later we'll return to this important matter of the place of the ANC in the context of the counter-revolution. You will recall that earlier I said that there were two reasons for the radical change between Dr. Andres' ages 1 and 2, the one economic and exogenous, and the other political and endogenous. In terms of the latter, I was referring to the change in the leadership of the ANC engineered by the counter-revolution, one of the major events during these first 30 years of our democracy. I will now discuss another important event which occurred during this 30-year period. I'd like to believe that nobody would contest the assertion that governance in any country would face serious challenges if denied access to state revenues, electricity, and a properly functioning economy. The South African Revenue Service, SARS, accounts for 95 to 98% of state revenues. From age 1 into age 2, Dr. Andres' ages, SARS outperformed itself in terms of revenue collection, with each year being better than the one before. However, this changed from the 2014-2015 financial year, with SARS underperforming in an ascending manner in the following years. Alarmed at this development, which meant an ever-shrinking pool of state revenues, President Ramaphosa appointed a Judicial Commission of Inquiry into SARS, empowered to make the necessary recommendation to address whatever shortcomings the Commission might have unearthed. Led by Justice Robert Nugent, this became known as the Nugent Commission. It submitted its final report to the President in December 2018. To cut to the bone, the Nugent Commission made the startling finding that some people had set out to destroy SARS. And it explained in detail how this was done. And obviously, the destruction of SARS would mean the destruction of the democratic state, given its unique place in terms of the provision of state revenues. It was exactly the success of this process of destruction which had resulted in the escalating underperformance of SARS from the financial year 2014-15, which set off the alarm, obviously contrary to the wishes of those who wanted to destroy the service. And one of the things which stood out in the Nugent Commission report, was the role that the well-known US business consultancy, Bain & Company, had played in planning and participating in the attempted destruction of SARS. The Commission also detailed the extensive process of consultation which had taken place between Bain and then President Jacob Zuma. President Zuma himself had appointed the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, which was led by Justice Raymond Zondo, and was therefore called the Zondo Commission. This commission also looked into SARS, building on the work already done by the Nugent Commission. And here let me quote some of what the Zondo Commission says. Quote, "The SARS evidence is a clear example of how the private sector colluded with the executive, including President Zuma, to capture an institution that was highly regarded internationally and render it ineffective. All these actions and events aimed at dismantling SARS cannot be coincidental. This is especially so in the light of the planning document which the Commission has been shown. The only feasible conclusion is that the organization was deliberately captured, and President Zuma and Mr. Moyane was the CEO of SARS, the head of SARS. The only feasible conclusion is that the organization was deliberately captured, and President Zuma and Mr. Moyane played critical roles in the capture of SARS and dismantling it in the way it was done during Mr. Moyane's term as commissioner. It is a notable feature of the SARS evidence, in contrast to the rest of the evidence which the Commission had, that this is one of the few instances where President Zuma was himself directly and personally involved in the activities and plans to take over a government entity, namely SARS. Another was ESCOM, which is discussed elsewhere in this report," unquote. Obviously, this confronts us with a conundrum. Here, according to the judicial commissions, we have a head of government who joins a process to reduce the very revenues he needs to enable the government to discharge its responsibilities, up to the point of the possible collapse of that government. So how do we explain this puzzle? The only logical way to explain it is that, challenging as it might be, even to comprehend, here we're dealing with a wolf in sheepskin. So finally we see that Thabo Mbeki corroborates what I spoke about, especially with the use of the NDR in Ghana, okay? And the NDR was, like I spoke about, it was a leftist construct. In fact, the NDR, according to another author, which I actually enjoy reading a lot, his name is Jeffrey Haynes. He speaks about how the acronym NDR stems from socialist lexicon, which implied to the Ghanaian left, especially at the time, to establish a version of Mao Zedong's new democracy, especially this is now in China. And so, according to the Haynes, the tenets of Mao's new democracy involved the destruction of old capitalist production relations and the establishment of a hegemony of political power led by workers and peasants, and the construction of a new legal ideological framework. Okay, so according to Mao Zedong, this is Chinese communist leader at the time, this was the idea behind the National Democratic Revolution. It was supposed to collapse capitalist productionist relations, right? And set up the atmosphere, the political, legal, and structural atmosphere for a takeover by the peasants and what we would likely call the proletariat. And so, in other words, it would dictate a hegemony of the proletarian, right? And so this is the goal of socialism, Mao Zedong socialism, especially through the National Democratic Revolution, and then the full-blown communism, which this whole ideology tends to go. Now, in trying to read that in South Africa, it's for me, it's really
it's really mind-boggling. How do we imagine, for example, all of the entrepreneurs in South Africa who have built and worked really hard to make South Africa the sort of like the capitalist basket in a way? This is my reading now of that region, the South Africa, right? In terms of its productivity, when you look at the largest economies in Africa today, we boast about having South Africa, we boast about having Nigeria, we boast about these nations as one of the biggest. And the reason they're so large, I believe, is because of this indoctrinated capitalist consciousness that is ingrained within the society. So I'm originally Nigerian. In Nigerian history, you would hardly come across an attempt to push the nation into a socialist trajectory ideologically, except probably the reasons behind the 1967 Biafran War, which was driven by the fact that the officers who thought that Nigeria had been on a trajectory of corruption were Marxists. They were imbibed Marxists. So I conducted a research where I discovered that one of the proponents of the war, Kaduna Nzogu, who was a major, who was of the Igbo extraction at the time, but spoke fluent Hausa language, had been reading a lot of Marxist literature. And he had also come to the conclusion that a Marxist trajectory would be the only way to overturn a capitalist hegemony in in the space where Nigeria, especially colonialism, had established the post-colonial nation, especially the capitalism in the post-colonial nation of Nigeria. And so these are the ideologies, especially even in the world stage anyway. We see even the effervescence of Marxism when Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto spoke about how, communism is actually the most efficient way to overturn the hegemony of the bourgeoisie in a society and allow for the rulership of the peasants and the proletariat. So this is natural Marxist, what you would call non-materialist perspective to history. Or the materialist perspective to history. Okay, so but in putting this into context in the South African space, I think it's really tricky because how then would we define all of the major entrepreneurs, the capitalists who have built South Africa? So we see that in one of the videos I argued where one of the youth representative of the UIM party speaks about how South Africa has lost, I think probably half of its billionaires have left South Africa abroad, and that's he argued that was a massive loss to the nation. And so he speaks about how as an entrepreneur or somebody who is really capitalistic in his mindset would actually feel the environment of South Africa being hostile to business and hostile to entrepreneurial activity, and then slowly proves and reflects this idea that South Africa might be on a future towards achieving a communist society within that space. And I don't know how it could feel. I don't know what the future of a communist South Africa could look like. But it's really tricky to understand how that could play out because, like Thabo Mbeki here speaks about Jacob Zuma, in that Jacob Zuma had also, I found another document where Jacob Zuma wrote a lot about what he achieved during his presidency from 2009 to 2018. And most of those policies, you would read carefully that they sort of like aligned to the policies of the left. So in other words, there was more of welfareism, the kind of things you would see during the Nkrumah era from 1957 to 1966 in Ghana, where Nkrumah wanted to pursue free education, a welfare state, and all that. But one of the challenges of a welfare state in Ghana was the fact that there had to be a vehicle producing constantly the capital needed to fund the welfare state, okay? And so Thabo Mbeki speaks about how Jacob Zuma, during his presidency, set up policies that prevented the production of the very capital he needed to capitalize and drive the policies he needed to change South Africa. So we see this whole dichotomy. It's more like a Confucianist perspective in this drive to building a socialist or communist South Africa. And this is also my struggle because I really don't know. I don't know if maybe communism or socialism seems to be the right ideology at the moment for many of these stricken African states, because communism or socialism, in a way, is a kind of ideology that has to have the groundwork prepared, okay? And having that groundwork prepared would mean lots of years of sacrifice in setting the people's mindset right, setting the structures right, and ready for the flourishing of this ideology. And I know many Africans and many people would actually say that before one can be free, there has to be years of sacrifice. I really understand that. But with the current state of hunger and despondence in the continent at the moment, I don't know if that sacrifice might be really necessary. And for me, I am a historian. I tend to learn a lot from history. So when I go back to Ghana's history in 1981 all the way to 1990s during the Jerry Rawlings era, there were proponents for this sacrifice, okay, and they had to move on playing with these really large socialist leftist theories at the time, which Jerry Rawlings got tired of and had to switch to the mentality of the right. So we now had the technocrats, carrying on the policies of the IMF and the World Bank structural adjustment programs, and that kind of like allowed financial breath into the economy of Ghana once more, and the society sort of like took off for a brief moment before heading down once more when the country shifted to a democratic phase by 2002. But for South Africa here, it's really tricky because it might have a really sharp nosedive in a way in trying to have that switch, the full-blown national democratic revolution, which is a full-blown shift to the policies of the left, and it would mean deepening welfareism, which would be discouraging, especially for honest entrepreneurs and capitalist-driven individuals who would like to switch up a lot of things. And I know the EFF speaks about how investments in discussions with Julius Malema and how he would fund his EFF manifesto. He speaks about how funding would come from Russia and China, and that there will be some other investors that are non-Western that would keep on the funding for these policies. And for me, since I also learned from history, I remember also during my personal discussions with the former letter exchange with the former president Jerry Rawlings at the time, who is now late, he spoke about how Russia was emboldened by a lot of these challenges at the time of the Cold War, and they really couldn't assist the leftist wing of the government at the time. And so this was one of the reasons why he had to switch to the technocracy in Ghana at the time, and who got on the full blast with the structural adjustment program, which then saved Ghana from the difficult times it would have faced. So for South Africa, it's really tricky because we really don't know how the view of communist South Africa could look like, and the scenarios for a leftist communist South Africa could feel like. But I suspect that it would really mean a lot of taking out of capital that actually already exists there in South Africa, taking that out, and which would cause a really immediate shock at the moment. I think there will be hard times if we don't have an immediate replacement by investments from left-wing countries to bolstering up the what I would call a hole that would have been made by the extraction of capital by capitalist investors at the moment. But I don't know, this has been a lot of information. I'm still trying to understand, and I'll keep posting speeches here to help us understand, so we can get a collective understanding of where South Africa lies in this whole quagmire it's found itself. But what do you guys think about this? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please share and like and subscribe, because that's the way you support Kwazemi as a channel, an Afrocentric channel, where we try to understand deeper issues in African history and hopefully develop a collective intelligence on how we wish to build the Africa we want to see as people of Africa. See you in the next one.